He sat at his own wedding reception while his wife's family mocked him in front of 400 people. And he smiled and said nothing and reached into his jacket pocket to touch a letter he had been carrying for 2 days without opening. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man they had spent 4 years calling their daughter's biggest mistake was the anonymous founder of a $4 trillion technology company. And for 3 of those 4 years, while his wife's family laughed at him across the dinner table, they had been writing million-dollar checks to a company he built in a college dorm room before any of them knew his name. He didn't expose them the night of the wedding. He waited. He planned. And when he was ready, he didn't just walk away. He pulled the foundation out from under everything they had ever built, piece by piece, in the exact order that would hurt the most. What does a man do when he has the power to destroy the people who humiliated him, and chooses to wait until the moment is perfect? If this story is already hitting different, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you're new here, because we drop these every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Let's see how far this one travels. Now let me take you all the way back to a Saturday evening in Memphis, Tennessee, to a ballroom that cost $180,000 to rent for one night, and to a man sitting at his own wedding reception who already knew exactly how this was going to end. His name was Calvin Reeves, and he was sitting at his own wedding reception like a man who had nowhere better to be. That was how they saw him anyway. That was the story the room told itself every time someone glanced in his direction. The quiet one, the IT consultant, the man Tanya Barksdale had somehow ended up with, despite everything her family had built and everything they believed they deserved. He sat near the head table in a rented tuxedo that fit him well enough, holding a glass of sparkling water he had not touched, watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that watching was more useful than speaking. The grand ballroom of the Peabody Hotel was dressed within an inch of its life. Ivory draping from the ceiling, roses on every surface, candles that cost $40 apiece, and a 12-piece band from New Orleans that the Barksdales had flown in specifically. 400 guests filled the space with laughter and perfume, and the particular energy of a celebration where the host family needed everyone present to understand exactly how much the evening had cost. Loretta Barksdale had mentioned the figure 3 times before the appetizers arrived, $180,000. She said it the way some people say grace, with reverence and the quiet expectation of applause. Calvin had heard it each time. He had nodded each time. He had said nothing each time. The seating arrangement told its own story, as seating arrangements always do. The Barksdale family and their associates occupied the front half of the ballroom, clustered around the head table in a formation that communicated clearly who mattered and who was present as a courtesy. Calvin's people, his mother Gloria, his aunt Diane, his 2 cousins Marcus and Terence, who had driven up from Chattanooga in Marcus's Tahoe, had been placed at a round table near the back wall beside the service entrance, close enough to the DJ setup that conversation required leaning in and raising your voice. Loretta had described the arrangement to Tanya as a spacing decision. The room told a different story. Gloria Reeves had said nothing about the table. She had smoothed her dress, sat down straight, and asked Aunt Diane if the chicken was good. That was who his mother was. That had always been who his mother was. Calvin was thinking about this, about the precise architecture of that seating chart, about the effort it must have taken to make exclusion look like logistics. When Derek Barksdale picked up the wireless microphone from the bandleader's stand without asking and tapped it twice to get the room's attention. Derek was 44 years old and built like a man who had played college ball 2 decades ago and still dressed like he might be called back. His suit was custom. His watch caught the light every time he moved his hand, which was often, because Derek Barksdale moved through rooms as though they were stages. He cleared his throat, grinned at the crowd, and the room settled. He said he just wanted to say a few words about his sister. What followed was not a few words. What followed was 6 minutes of material that the room received like a performance, laughing at the right moments, gasping softly at others, applauding at the turns. Derek called Calvin Tanya's little IT project with the comfortable delivery of a man who had workshopped the line. He said, with a grin that the room ate up, that Calvin's net worth was roughly equivalent to Derek's annual dry cleaning bill. He paused for the laughter. He got it. He asked the assembled 400 people to raise a glass, not to the couple, but to his sister's patience, because Lord knows, he said, it takes a special kind of woman to see potential where the rest of us just see a help desk ticket. 400 people laughed. Tanya laughed, her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Loretta Barksdale sat at the head table with her eyes bright and damp, dabbing at the corner of one eye with a monogrammed handkerchief, the way people dab when they are moved by joy rather than sadness. Calvin smiled. It was a real smile, or close enough to one that no one at the head table noticed the difference. He had practiced stillness for long enough that it had become his natural condition. He felt his mother's hand find his under the table, her fingers wrapping around his, squeezing once, saying everything she would never say out loud. He squeezed back, and then, without thinking about it, his right hand moved to the inside breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His fingers found the edge of a folded envelope. It was letter-sized, sealed, addressed to him in the precise handwriting of a man named Raymond Holt, and it had been sitting in that pocket for 2 days without being opened. Calvin knew roughly what it said. Raymond had called. Raymond had explained enough on the phone that the letter was more confirmation than revelation, but he had not opened it. He had decided to wait until after the wedding. He could not have said precisely why, only that it felt correct, that some part of him had wanted to sit in this room and see it clearly one more time, to have no ambiguity left about what this family was and what they thought of him. He had seen it clearly now. His fingers held the edge of the envelope for a moment. Then he tucked it back, smoothed the front of his jacket, and picked up his glass of water. Tonight was not the night, but the night was coming. To understand what happened to the Barksdale family, you had to go back 4 years. You had to go back to before the wedding, before the reception, before the toast and the laughter and the letter in the pocket. You had to go back to the very first Sunday dinner. Calvin had met Tanya Barksdale at a mutual friend's cookout in Midtown Memphis the summer before everything began. She was sharp and funny and beautiful in a way that made a room adjust itself around her, and he had liked her immediately and honestly. She had liked him too. That part was real in the beginning. He believed it then, and he did not stop believing it even later, when believing it no longer served him. It was simply true. They had dated for 8 months before she brought him to Sunday dinner at her parents' house in Germantown, and those 8 months had been the last uncomplicated time in his relationship with the Barksdale family. The house in Germantown was a 6-bedroom colonial on a corner lot, with a 3-car garage and a lawn that was maintained by a service that came on Thursdays. Loretta Barksdale had greeted Calvin at the door in a silk blouse and a pearl necklace, smiled the particular smile of a woman who had already made her assessment and found the subject wanting, and said it was so nice to finally meet Tanya's friend. Not boyfriend, friend. The correction was surgical. Dinner that first Sunday was pot roast and sweet potato casserole, and a pitcher of sweet tea that nobody touched because the family drank sparkling water with lemon. Calvin had reached for the sweet tea out of habit. Loretta had watched him pour it without a word, and then when he set the pitcher down, she had said, so gently it almost sounded like concern, that they usually saved that for the children's table. The table laughed. Tanya smiled into her napkin. Calvin said that was fine and set his glass down. That was the beginning. Harold Barksdale, the family patriarch, was a tall man with silver at his temples and the slow confidence of someone who had been important for so long that importance had become his resting expression. He ran Barksdale Medical Group in the same way that a figurehead runs a country. His name was on everything, his face appeared in the annual report, and the actual decisions were made by other people. He asked Calvin twice that first Sunday what he did for a living. Both times, Calvin told him. Both times Harold nodded with the expression of a man being told the weather in a city he had no plans to visit. Derek was the one who sharpened things. Derek Barksdale had the build of a man who had played college ball 20 years ago and the wardrobe of a man who needed you to know he could afford better than you. He sat at Sunday dinners like a moderator at a panel he had personally convened, redirecting conversation, inserting opinions that weren't requested, and watching Calvin with a specific kind of attention. The attention of someone measuring a threat and finding it insufficient. At the third Sunday dinner, Derek asked Calvin what his 5-year plan looked like. The question was asked loudly enough that the whole table heard it. Calvin said he was focused on building his client portfolio. Derek had nodded slowly and said that was smart, to have modest goals. The table moved on, Calvin filed it away. The years that followed had a rhythm to them. Thanksgiving at the Barksdale house in Germantown, Christmas at Loretta's sister's place in Collierville, Easter with the whole extended family at Second Baptist, where the Barksdales had a named pew and 3 generations of photographs in the hallway. Calvin attended everything. He brought flowers for Loretta. He shook Harold's hand. He sat across from Derek at more dinners than he could count, and absorbed more subtle dismissals than a lesser man would have tolerated for a week. The cruelty was never explosive. That was what made it so effective. It lived in Loretta asking Tanya, in Calvin's presence, whether she had considered keeping the Barksdale name professionally, since her career was, after all, attached to the family brand. It lived in Derek mentioning the company's valuation at dinner with the casualness of someone who wanted the number in the room. $340 million, not bad for something Grandad started with 30,000 and a prayer. And then looking at Calvin in a way that needed no words. It lived in Harold at a family barbecue the summer after the wedding, asking Calvin what exactly IT consultants did all day, with the tone of a man genuinely puzzled by how a person could occupy space without producing anything of value. Tanya had started soft. In the early years, she would touch Calvin's arm after a cutting remark, a small apology encoded in the gesture. But families are gravitational, and over time she drifted toward the center of hers. By the 3rd year, she laughed when Derek made the jokes. By the 4th, she made a few of her own. Calvin never once raised his voice. Not at dinner, not in the car afterward, not in the quiet of their bedroom, when the weight of the evening sat heavy between them. He listened, he nodded, he drove home. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table for a while before coming to bed. That was who Calvin Reeves was. That was what 4 years had looked like. What the Barksdales did not know. What they could not have known because it was the last thing any of them would have thought to investigate, was that for 3 of those 4 years, every time they sat at that polished dining room table and looked at Calvin like he was something that had wandered in from a lesser world, they were being subsidized by a company that man had built before any of them knew his name. Here is the truth about Calvin Reeves that nobody in the Barksdale family ever thought to look for. He had been 24 years old, living in a dorm room at Vanderbilt on a partial scholarship and a federal loan that he tracked to the dollar in a notebook he kept beside his bed. The room was barely large enough for 2 desks. His roommate went home on weekends. Calvin stayed and worked and built something in those quiet Saturday hours that would eventually become one of the most consequential technology companies on Earth. The company was called Stratum AI. It ran under the public brand name Stratum Global. By the time Calvin sat at that wedding reception in his rented tuxedo and listened to Derek Barksdale call him a help desk ticket, Stratum Global was the 3rd largest company by market capitalization anywhere in the world, not in the South, not in the technology sector, in the world. Calvin had not set out to be invisible. Invisibility had been forced on him first, and then he had chosen it. At 23, a year before the company launched, he had pitched a small group of early investors in Nashville. 2 of them had spent the better part of that meeting trying to restructure the ownership agreement in ways that would have handed them controlling interest within 18 months. Calvin had recognized the pattern for what it was. He had read enough to know exactly what was being attempted. And he had walked out of that meeting and driven back to his dorm room and sat for a long time in the dark. He called a law professor he trusted the following morning. The professor referred him to a trust and estate attorney named Raymond Holt. Raymond was 57 now, with silver at his temples and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck, and the unshakable calm of a man who had spent 3 decades protecting serious wealth from serious threats. He had listened to Calvin's situation without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions, and then laid out a structure so clean and so airtight that not even the most aggressive investor in Memphis could have found a thread to pull. Majority ownership transferred into a blind trust. Calvin designated as the sole beneficiary. All distributions routed as consulting income. The company's founding attributed legally to a shell entity operating under the alias C. Aaron Wells. Calvin had signed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. He had driven back to Nashville that evening, stopped at a Waffle House on the interstate, and eaten scrambled eggs and toast, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely settled. The alias was a survival tool at first. Then it became something else. It became a filter. It showed Calvin exactly who people were when they thought he had nothing, and it showed him what people became when they thought he had everything. And after enough years of watching both versions of that test play out, he found he preferred the silence. He preferred being the man at the quiet end of the dinner table to being the man the dinner table rearranged itself around. Which was why he was still that man when he first walked into the Barksdale's Germantown house and watched Loretta note the cut of his jacket and make her determination in approximately 4 seconds flat. The meeting with Raymond happened every quarter in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville that had Calvin's real name nowhere on the directory. They reviewed the trust, reviewed distributions, reviewed any operational matters that required Calvin's direction. It was, in every way, a routine meeting. Calvin drove up, sat down, drank the coffee Raymond's assistant brought without being asked, and worked through the agenda. It was at the 2nd quarterly meeting of that year, 6 months before the wedding, 3 months before he would buy a ring, that Raymond slid a page across the table and pointed to a line item on the client roster. Barksdale Medical Group, Memphis, Tennessee. Enterprise Diagnostic License. Annual value $4,200,000. Renewed automatically for 3 consecutive years. Calvin looked at the name for a long moment. Raymond said it had come in through a procurement broker 3 years prior, signed under the C. Aaron Wells alias, and had been auto-renewing since. Standard enterprise agreement, nothing irregular on Stratum's end. He mentioned it only because Calvin generally liked to know the names behind large accounts, and this one was local. Calvin sat very still. He thought about the Sunday dinners. He thought about the sparkling water nobody touched and the sweet tea designated for the children's table. He thought about Derek saying $340 million. Not bad for something Grandad started. He thought about Harold asking twice what IT consultants did all day. He thought about all of it for a long moment, and then he thanked Raymond, folded the page, and said he would follow up if there was anything to address. He drove back to Memphis that afternoon. He stopped at the same Waffle House on the interstate. He ordered the same eggs and toast. He sat there for a while. 3 months later, he proposed to Tanya at a restaurant in East Memphis she had chosen herself. She said yes, while the table beside them applauded. He slid the ring onto her finger and smiled at her across the candlelight. And the smile was real, because some part of him had still been hoping she was different from her family. He was not wrong to hope. He was only wrong about the outcome. The letter Raymond sent 2 days before the wedding was not a surprise. Calvin had known, in some interior way, that a deadline was coming. What the letter represented was not new information. It was permission. Calvin left Memphis before sunrise. He did not tell Tanya where he was going. He changed out of the tuxedo, folded it over the back of a chair, made a cup of coffee he barely touched, and walked out to his car in the grey early morning, with the letter still folded in the breast pocket of the jacket he now wore. The drive to Nashville was 1 hour and 15 minutes on a quiet Sunday. He drove the speed limit the entire way. Raymond Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville that had no names of consequence in its lobby directory. Calvin had been coming here for 12 years. He knew which elevator ran faster, which chair in the waiting area had a loose armrest, and that Raymond's assistant always had coffee ready before Calvin sat down. Not because anyone called ahead, but because Raymond's assistant had been doing this job for 22 years, and knew what a Sunday morning appointment meant. Calvin sat. He drank the coffee. Raymond came in at 8 minutes after 8, reading glasses on the chain around his neck, a manila folder under one arm, moving with the particular unhurriedness of a man who had never needed to perform urgency in his life. Raymond sat across from him and opened the folder. He began with the legal structure. Calvin knew all of this, but Raymond walked through it anyway because Raymond believed that decisions made on partial information were the source of most of the world's unnecessary suffering. The blind trust established 12 years prior. The C. Aaron Wells alias registered to the shell entity that held the founding stake. Stratum Global's current market capitalization, $4.1 trillion. Calvin's trust stake, at current valuation, approximately $180 billion. Calvin looked at the number on the page. He had not looked at it in some time. Raymond moved to the specific matter. 3 years prior, Barksdale Medical Group had approached Stratum's enterprise division through a procurement broker. Standard B2B contact, nothing unusual. The contract had been signed under the C. Aaron Wells entity, as all Stratum enterprise agreements were. $4.2 million per year. Auto-renewing. The platform had gone live across all 11 of Barksdale Medical's clinic locations and currently handled 2,200 patient interactions per day. Raymond paused there to let the number settle. Then he explained the problem. A routine annual trust audit, conducted 6 weeks prior, had flagged the Barksdale Medical account. The trust's own operating charter contained a conflict of interest clause, standard language in instruments of this kind, which required disclosure or divestment when a trust beneficiary and a contracted client were found to have a direct personal relationship. Calvin's marriage to Tanya Barksdale Reeves constituted precisely that relationship. The charter did not offer a middle path. Calvin was legally required to either disclose his identity as the trust's beneficiary to Barksdale Medical, which meant disclosing his identity as Stratum's founder, or execute a formal non-renewal of the license. Raymond also explained what non-renewal would trigger. Under Tennessee state law, when an enterprise AI platform used in clinical diagnosis was terminated for conflict of interest reasons, the terminating party's compliance team was required to notify the Tennessee State Medical Board. Not optionally, not at their discretion, required. Calvin absorbed all of this with the stillness of a man listening to a weather report. Then Raymond set down his pen, took off his reading glasses, and looked across the table. He said he understood this was not a simple situation. He said he understood there were personal dimensions that went beyond the legal framework. He said he had been Calvin's attorney for 12 years, and he had never once told Calvin what to do, and he was not going to start today. He asked Calvin what he wanted to do. The room was quiet. Calvin thought about the letter he had carried in his pocket for 2 days without opening. He thought about why he had carried it without opening it, and what that said about where he had already arrived before he ever sat down in this chair. He thought about Derek Barksdale standing at a microphone in a room full of people who knew his mother's name, calling him a help desk ticket while she sat beside the service entrance in her good dress and said nothing and gripped her son's hand. He thought about $12.6 million, $12.6 million that the Barksdale family had paid, unknowingly, cheerfully, as a routine line item in their annual operating budget, to a company their son-in-law had built before any of them knew he existed. 3 years of Sunday dinners, 3 years of polished condescension and dry-cleaning jokes and the particular cruelty of people who needed you to be small so they could stay large. 3 years of checks made out to see Aaron Wells. Calvin set down his coffee cup. He said 4 words, "Send the non-renewal notice." Raymond nodded once, put his glasses back on, and wrote something in the margin of the folder. No drama, no pause for effect, just 2 professionals in a quiet room on a Sunday morning, doing what needed to be done. Calvin drove back to Memphis the same way he had come, speed limit, both hands on the wheel. The morning had opened up into a pale winter sun by the time he crossed the state line, and he let the light come through the windshield and warm the dashboard and thought about nothing in particular. The notice would take 8 days to be prepared, reviewed, and formally delivered. 8 days was not a long time. Calvin had already waited 4 years. 8 days was nothing. The 8 days that followed were the quietest of Calvin's life. Not quiet in the way of emptiness or dread, quiet in the way of a man who has made his decision and has nothing left to debate with himself. He went to work on Monday morning. He answered emails. He ate lunch at the same diner on Poplar Avenue, where he had been eating lunch on Mondays for 3 years. The catfish plate with the cornbread that came in a small cast-iron skillet. He tipped the same amount he always tipped. He drove home the same route. To anyone watching, Calvin Reeves looked like a man in the unremarkable middle of an ordinary week. That was exactly what he intended. The plan, as Raymond had helped him shape it over 2 careful phone calls, was designed with a single governing principle: no fingerprints. Calvin would make no calls to journalists. He would send no anonymous tips. He would draft no letters, post nothing, and say nothing to anyone in Memphis about what was coming. Every action that destroyed the Barksdale family's world would be initiated by the legal system operating precisely as it was designed to operate. Calvin would simply be the man who set the machinery in motion and then stepped back and let it run. The sequencing mattered. Raymond had been clear about that. First, the non-renewal notice to Barksdale Medical, formally prepared and delivered by Stratum Global's enterprise compliance team. That was the opening move, the one that would land on someone's desk and begin its journey upward through the company's legal structure until it reached Derek. Second, on the same day the notice was delivered, Raymond's compliance team would file the mandatory disclosure with the Tennessee State Medical Board, not optional, not discretionary, required by law. Both documents landing simultaneously meant that by the time Derek understood what the first one said, the second one would already be in the hands of a state regulatory body and out of everyone's control. Calvin also made one additional instruction, separated cleanly from the rest. He asked Raymond to flag the Barksdale Medical vendor relationship to Stratum Global's outside counsel for a standard conflict of interest review, given the active divorce proceedings involving the company's founder. This was procedurally correct. It was also the mechanism that would eventually reach Marcus Webb's law firm, though Calvin never needed to name Marcus Webb, never needed to issue a directive, never needed to do anything except follow the process that Raymond had already designed. The outside counsel review would do the rest on its own timeline, in its own procedurally clean way. That was the elegance of it. Calvin had not built a weapon. He had simply removed the safety from the one that already existed. Tanya texted him on day 3 and again on day 6. Both messages were about Thanksgiving, whether they would be hosting or going to her parents' house, whether Calvin wanted to invite his cousins up from Chattanooga. He read both messages and responded the same way he always responded to domestic logistics: brief, agreeable, no cause for alarm. She sent a small heart emoji after the second exchange. He set his phone down and went back to his book. On day 5, he drove to Chattanooga. His mother lived in the same house she had lived in since Calvin was 7 years old, a brick ranch on a quiet street in East Chattanooga, with a porch that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that had always made Calvin feel, when he sat in the chair beside hers, that time moved differently there. Gloria had sweet tea ready before he got through the door. She did not ask questions right away. She let him sit. She let the afternoon do what it always did. Then she asked if he was okay. He told her he had handled it. He said it simply and directly, the way she had taught him to speak when something was serious, and he wanted her to know she did not need to carry it. She looked at him for a moment, with the particular look that mothers develop over decades, the one that sees past the words to the intention underneath. And then she nodded once and refreshed his glass. She did not ask what he had handled. She already knew the kind of man he was. She had made him that man. She understood that when Calvin said he had handled something, it meant the thing was done correctly, and the people who needed protecting had been protected. They sat on the porch until the sun dropped behind the tree line. She told him about the church's new choir director. He told her about the catfish plate at the diner on Poplar Avenue. They talked about his cousin Marcus and whether Marcus was ever going to propose to the woman he had been seeing since the previous Christmas. They did not talk about the Barksdales. They did not need to. He drove back to Memphis that evening and slept soundly for the first time since the wedding. On the morning of day 8, Raymond called at 7:52. He said only that both notices had been delivered and confirmed received. Non-renewal. Medical board disclosure. Everything filed correctly. Everything documented. Everything clean. Calvin thanked him and ended the call. He stood at his kitchen window for a moment with his coffee, looking at the quiet Memphis street outside, the early light coming through the oak trees in long, pale strips. Somewhere across town, 40 miles away in the Barksdale Medical Group's legal department, someone was opening an envelope. The envelope arrived at Barksdale Medical Group's legal department at 9:47 in the morning. The general counsel, a careful woman named Patricia Odom, who had been with the company for 11 years, opened it the way she opened everything, methodically, without urgency. Vendor correspondence came through that office regularly. Platform agreements, service renewals, compliance updates. She assumed this was routine. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. The letter was from Stratum Global's Enterprise Compliance Division. Formal language, precise structure, no room for misinterpretation. It stated that the Enterprise Diagnostic License currently held by Barksdale Medical Group under account reference C. Aaron Wells would not be renewed at the conclusion of the current contract term. The reason cited was a conflict of interest provision within the trust instrument governing the license's ownership structure. The platform's wind-down period was 90 days from the date of the letter. Patricia set the letter down and pulled up the vendor file. The account had been active for 3 years, $4.2 million per year. Auto-renewing, 0 flags, 0 disputes. She ran a trace on the entity name, C. Aaron Wells. Through the standard vendor verification system, she got a shell company registered in Delaware. She ran the shell, she hit another layer, she ran that layer, she hit a trust structure so cleanly constructed that it returned nothing of use, no directors, no officers, no individual of record. The kind of structure that cost serious money to build and serious money to maintain. This was not a clerical error. Patricia called Derek. Derek arrived at the Barksdale Medical Group boardroom 40 minutes later in a suit that had not been his first choice for the day, moving with the brisk energy of a man who had decided in the elevator that this was going to be a simple problem. He sat at the head of the table. Patricia laid out both documents in front of him because the second document, the simultaneous notification from the Tennessee State Medical Board, had arrived by email at 10:15, and it was, if anything, worse than the first. Derek read the non-renewal notice. He read the medical board notification. He told Patricia this was a clerical error and instructed her to call Stratum Global's legal team directly to get it corrected. Patricia made the call while Derek sat at the table and checked his phone. She was on hold for 4 minutes. Then a member of Stratum Global's outside counsel came on the line and read a prepared statement. Conflict confirmed. Non-renewal stands. The matter had been referred to the Trust's compliance office and no further discussion was possible through this channel. The call ended. Derek stared at the speakerphone for a moment. Then he told Patricia to find out who C. Aaron Wells was. Patricia told him she had already tried. The Trust structure was a wall, clean, legal, and completely impenetrable through standard vendor investigation channels. Whoever had built it specifically so that no one on the outside could trace it back to an individual without a court order. And even then, the process would take months. Derek spent the next 3 hours calling in every legal favor he had in Memphis. A partner at a downtown firm who owed him a referral. A former colleague who now worked in corporate compliance. A contact at a litigation shop that specialized in exactly this kind of corporate structure investigation. Every one of them came back with the same answer. The trust was clean. The alias was legitimate. Without litigation and a discovery process that would take 6 months minimum, there was nothing to find and no one to pressure. It was like trying to grab smoke. By early afternoon, Loretta had called Tanya 4 times. Tanya had no answers because she genuinely had none. Calvin had said nothing to her, texted her normally about Thanksgiving plans, given her nothing to report. The conversation between mother and daughter ended badly for the first time in Tanya's memory, Loretta's voice going cold in a way that Tanya had only ever heard directed at other people. The platform wind-down notice went out to all 11 clinic locations by end of day. 90 days to transition 2,200 patient interactions per day off the Stratum diagnostic system and onto whatever replacement the company could find in time. The clinic managers called the corporate office. The corporate office called Derek. Derek told them he had it handled. At 4 in the afternoon, Derek stood before the Barksdale Medical Board and delivered a statement with the composed confidence of a man who had spent 20 years performing certainty in rooms that required it. He said the vendor situation was a procedural dispute. He said the medical board inquiry was a routine notification triggered automatically by the licensing issue and would be resolved alongside it. He said he would have the entire matter corrected within 72 hours. The board nodded. They had always nodded when Derek spoke with authority. He walked out of that meeting and stood alone in the hallway outside the boardroom and looked at his phone. C. Aaron Wells, a shell company in Delaware. A trust so sealed it returned nothing. He would not resolve it in 72 hours. He did not know that yet. But the feeling in his chest, the one he had been refusing to name since Patricia first put that letter on the table, was beginning to tell him the truth. Something much larger than a vendor dispute had just begun. The 72 hours Derek promised came and went. Then week 2 arrived, and everything fell at once. The Tennessee State Medical Board's inquiry letter was a public record under state law. The Memphis Business Journal's legal reporter filed a Freedom of Information request on day 10. The document landed in the reporter's inbox on day 14. It named Barksdale Medical Group. It named the platform. It referenced a conflict of interest disclosure from Stratum Global's compliance team. The reporter started making calls. On day 15, the malpractice insurer sent its own letter. Coverage hold effective immediately, pending resolution of the medical board inquiry. The clinical implications were immediate and devastating. Barksdale Medical could not perform elective procedures at any of its 11 locations without triggering uninsured liability exposure. Scheduled surgeries were postponed. Patients were notified. Staff were told to hold calendars. The phones started ringing and did not stop. Word moved through the Memphis medical community the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, low, and total. 2 senior physicians had been on the verge of finalizing partnership agreements with Barksdale Medical. Dr. Anita Folsom, a cardiologist with a patient base that would have added $8 million in annual revenue, sent a letter through her attorney withdrawing from negotiations. Dr. James Cruz, an orthopedic surgeon who had been courted for 6 months, did the same thing the following day. Combined, their departure removed $14 million in projected annual revenue from Barksdale Medical's future. That same week, 3 hospital system partners paused their expansion negotiations indefinitely. The $90 million in projected network growth that Loretta had described at Thanksgiving dinner, the expansion she had mentioned with the casual confidence of a woman announcing something that had already happened, evaporated in 5 business days. The calls from the hospital partners were brief and professional. No accusations. No confrontations. Simply a statement that given the current regulatory environment surrounding the company, they felt it was prudent to pause discussions until the situation clarified. It would never clarify in time. Derek's suspension came on day 18. The Internal Review Committee, and a body Derek had personally helped design when he joined the board, found that the vendor approval process for the Stratum AI contract had bypassed 3 standard due diligence checkpoints. No independent vendor verification. No principal background review. No conflict of interest screening. Derek's name was on every resolution approving the contract. His signature was on the board, minutes presenting it as a modernization triumph. The committee asked him to step back from his board role pending the outcome of the review. Derek Barksdale, at 44 years old, had no office to go to. He had never in his adult life had no office to go to. Harold Barksdale attended the Memphis Presbyterian Hospital Charity Gala on the evening of day 22, wearing the same confidence he had worn to every public event for 40 years. He was 63 minutes into the evening when a board member he had known for a decade approached him near the silent auction tables and asked, with the precise politeness of someone who already knew the answer, whether Harold wanted to address the Stratum situation directly or wait for the journal story to come out first. Harold asked, "What story?" The board member excused himself. Harold Barksdale left the gala 19 minutes later. It was the first time in 40 years that he had left a room before he was ready. Marcus Webb sent Tanya a text on day 24, 3 sentences. He said he valued what they had built together, but that given recent developments, he felt it was best to step back. He said he hoped she understood. He did not explain what recent developments meant. She called him 4 times that evening. He did not answer. She called her mother. Loretta had no answers. Calvin, 40 miles away, was eating dinner at his kitchen table when his phone lit up with a news alert. The Memphis Business Journal story published at 6:47 in the evening on day 26. The headline read, "Stratum AI's reclusive founder revealed, currently divorcing into Barksdale family." The piece ran 1,200 words. It included Calvin's real name, his founding story, the Vanderbilt dorm room, the C. Aaron Wells alias, and why it had been created. It included a photograph of Calvin at 24, sitting at a desk covered in handwritten notes, squinting slightly at the camera as though surprised to be seen. Calvin read the article once. He set his phone face down on the table and finished his dinner. Across Memphis, 400 people who had attended a wedding reception at the Peabody Hotel's Grand Ballroom were reading the same story on their phones and their tablets and their laptops. People who had laughed at a toast, people who had applauded a punchline about a help desk ticket, people who had watched a retired school teacher from Chattanooga get seated beside a service entrance in her good dress and said nothing. They were reading it now. Loretta Barksdale sat at her kitchen table the following morning, the way she sat every morning, early, coffee already made, the Memphis Business Journal open in front of her. She was 67 years old, and she had been reading that paper at that table for 4 decades. She turned to the front page of the business section. Calvin's face looked back at her. She sat with that for a long time. 3 days later, Derek Barksdale called Calvin and asked for a meeting. Calvin told him he would need to call Raymond Holt's office to arrange it. Raymond Holt's conference room was on the 14th floor, and on a clear afternoon in Nashville it caught the kind of light that made everything in it look precise and permanent. Derek Barksdale arrived 11 minutes early with a personal attorney named Gerald Fitch, a broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit who carried a leather portfolio and the practiced calm of someone paid to project it. They sat on one side of the long conference table. Gerald set the portfolio down. Derek straightened his jacket. He had dressed carefully for this. The suit was his best one. He looked like a man preparing to negotiate. Calvin arrived alone. No attorney, no folder, no briefcase. He wore a plain dark jacket and slacks, and he sat down across from Derek without ceremony, without greeting, and without hurry. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Derek Barksdale with the patient, level attention of a man who had nowhere else to be. Derek began. He said there had clearly been a misunderstanding. He said family tensions around the divorce had created a perception of conflict that didn't reflect the actual business relationship. He said the Barksdale family valued their technology partnerships and had always operated in good faith. He said he was willing to discuss a path to license reinstatement, perhaps with modified terms, perhaps with a revised conflict structure, and that he believed With the right goodwill on both sides, this situation could be resolved in a way that worked for everyone involved. He talked for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Calvin let him finish. Then Calvin was quiet for a moment longer. Not a dramatic pause. Just the natural stillness of a man arranging what he wants to say in the exact order he wants to say it. He said he wanted to tell Derek about the first Sunday dinner. He described it precisely. The pot roast, the sparkling water that nobody touched, the sweet tea that Loretta had redirected to the children's table. He described the look on Loretta's face when she did it, gracious, helpful, completely deliberate. He described the drive home afterward and the particular silence in the car that Tanya had never once acknowledged. Then he described the Thanksgiving where Derek had raised the question of prenuptial terms at the dinner table in front of 11 people, his voice loud enough to carry, his smile designed for an audience. He described Harold asking him twice what IT consultants did all day, the second time with slightly more emphasis than the first, as though the first answer had been insufficient. He described the barbecue in the backyard where Tanya's cousin had laughed so hard at one of Derek's lines about Calvin's career prospects that she had to set down her plate. And then he described his own wedding night. He described the table by the service entrance. He described his mother sitting in her good dress beside the DJ equipment, the one she had ironed herself that morning, the one she wore to anything she considered important. He described her gripping his hand under the table while 400 people laughed at a punchline that had his name in it. He described the way she had asked Aunt Diane if the chicken was good, because that was who Gloria Reeves was. A woman who could be placed at the worst table in the room and still conduct herself with more dignity than anyone at the best one. Derek had not moved. Calvin said he wanted to tell Derek something else. He said that 6 months before the wedding, at a routine quarterly meeting with his attorney, a name had appeared on a client roster. Barksdale Medical Group, $4.2 million per year, 3 years of auto renewal, $12.6 million total, paid to a company Derek had never investigated because Derek had never thought the man at the children's table was worth investigating. He said that when Raymond had flagged the name, Calvin had sat with it for 6 months before doing anything. He had proposed to Tanya 3 months later. He had attended 3 more Sunday dinners, 2 holiday gatherings, and 1 wedding reception where his mother was seated beside the service entrance. He had done all of that knowing what he knew, not out of cruelty, out of the same patience he had been practicing for 4 years, because Calvin Reeves did not act until he was completely certain, and by the morning after the wedding, he was completely certain. He looked at Derek directly. He said, "You spent 4 years calling me Tanya's charity case, Derek. You put my mother next to the DJ booth at my own wedding. What you didn't know, what none of you knew, was that for 3 of those 4 years, your family's whole legacy, everything Grandad Barksdale built, was being kept alive by a company I founded in a dorm room at 24. You gave me a seat at your table. You just didn't know I owned the building." The room was absolutely still. Derek's jaw moved slightly. No words came. Gerald Fitch opened his portfolio, looked at something inside it, and closed it again. Derek said that there had to be something they could work out. He said the license, the terms, they could restructure everything. He said this didn't have to end this way. His voice had lost something. The projection, the performance, the ease of a man accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around him. What was left sounded smaller and more honest than anything Derek Barksdale had said in years. Calvin rose from his chair. He buttoned his jacket. He said he hoped Derek and his family found a way through what was coming. He said he meant that genuinely. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and said one last thing without turning around. He said, "The review process runs on its own timeline now, Derek. There's nothing left for either of us to do." He walked out. The elevator was waiting. He stepped in, pressed the lobby button, and watched the doors close on the 14th floor and everything it contained. The afternoon sun hit him when he stepped outside, warm and unhurried, the kind of Nashville afternoon that felt like a beginning rather than an end. In the months that followed, Memphis watched the Barksdale name come down slowly, the way old things come down. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece making the next one inevitable. Barksdale Medical Group completed its 90-day platform wind-down and emerged from the process as a fundamentally different company. The Tennessee State Medical Board inquiry ran its full course, finding no patient harm but issuing a formal censure regarding the licensing irregularities. The malpractice insurer reinstated coverage only after a comprehensive operational review that cost the company 4 months and significant legal fees. When the accounting was done, the network that Harold Barksdale had built from $30,000 and a prayer had been reduced from 11 clinic locations to 3. The valuation that Derek had dropped at dinner tables like a calling card, $340 million, collapsed to approximately $60 million. The majority stake sold to a regional hospital system in a transaction that gave the Barksdale family just enough to pay off their debts and nothing left to brag about. The Barksdale name remained on the building. It was the only thing that did. Derek Barksdale was permanently removed from the board 8 months after the medical board inquiry closed. The Internal Review Committee published its findings in a document that was, in the polite language of corporate governance, devastating. He opened a financial consulting practice in a small office in East Memphis. He listed himself on a professional directory. In the first year, he had no clients of note. The people who had laughed loudest at his toasts were no longer returning his calls. Loretta dissolved the Barksdale Charitable Foundation quietly, through an attorney, without a press release. There was no announcement. The foundation's page simply went dark one Tuesday. The social circles she had cultivated for 4 decades, the galas, the hospital boards, the Second Baptist Women's Auxiliary leadership, did not disappear overnight, but they reorganized themselves around her absence in a way that made clear she was no longer at the center. She still lived in the Germantown house. She still read the Memphis Business Journal every morning, but the paper no longer carried her name in a favorable context, and the city had a long memory. Tanya finalized the divorce 11 months after the wedding. The settlement was reasonable. Calvin had instructed Raymond to be fair, and fair was what it was. She returned to using the Barksdale name professionally, which was the only form of capital she had left to trade on. She found new work eventually. She built a quieter life. Calvin did not follow it closely. He wished her no harm and spent no more time thinking about her than the situation required. He moved to a modest house in East Nashville 6 months after the confrontation. 3 bedrooms, a small back porch, a kitchen with good light in the mornings. The truss structure remained intact. He drew the same distributions as always. He resumed an occasional guest lecture at Vanderbilt, once a semester, sometimes twice, under his own name, Calvin Reeves, which meant something now in a way it never had before, and which he mentioned to no one unless they asked. The Gloria Reeves Foundation launched 14 months after the wedding night. Calvin had spent those 14 months working with Raymond and a foundation attorney to build it correctly. The mission was precise: full-ride STEM scholarships for students from working-class families in Memphis and Chattanooga who showed exceptional ability and had no pathway to exceptional opportunity. The first cohort was 40 students. Calvin attended the announcement event in Chattanooga in a plain jacket with no entourage and sat in the back row and watched 40 young people learn that someone had decided they were worth the investment. His mother sat beside him. She did not grip his hand this time. She held it openly, the way you hold the hand of someone you are proud of. He met Simone Patterson at a Vanderbilt alumni gathering 18 months after the divorce. She was an architect from Nashville, quiet, precise about her opinions, funny in the dry and unhurried way of someone who was not performing for the room. A mutual friend introduced them. They talked for 40 minutes about a building they had both noticed on the same street in East Nashville. She did not ask about Stratum. She did not ask about the Barksdales. She did not ask about any of it because she had not looked him up before she arrived and would not look him up until much later, and when she eventually did, she told him she had already figured out the important parts from the conversation itself. On their third date, she asked him what he had been like in college. He told her about the dorm room and the notebooks and the Saturday mornings when his roommate went home and the building went quiet and he worked. She asked what he had worked on. He said he had been trying to build something that outlasted the circumstances he had come from. She said that seemed like a good reason to build anything. He agreed. Here is what this story means. True power does not announce itself at the door. It does not wear the right watch or drop the right numbers at dinner. It waits, it observes, it builds things that last. And the people who spend their lives measuring others by what they display, by the car and the title and the table and the name, will always be vulnerable to the man who decided a long time ago that the display was never the point. Calvin Reeves never wanted to destroy anyone. He wanted to be seen accurately. He wanted one room, one dinner table, one family to look at him and see what was actually there. When the world finally looked, it looked at the right man. So let me ask you something before we close. If you were in Calvin's position, if you had known for 6 months what his family was worth to the people laughing at you, what would you have done? Would you have waited the way he waited? Or would you have moved sooner? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear exactly this kind of story. And if you are new here and you made it all the way to the end, welcome. Subscribe, because we drop stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. I will see you in the next one.